Teacher, where does my will end and the will of the world begin? Where you cease to distinguish between the dream in which you are the smith and the hammer with which you forge. Alexey Gromov was a man made of dust, not the noble dust that settles on ancient stones, but the fine, pervasive dust of paper archives. His days were woven from turning the pages of others' fates, others' mistakes and achievements, sealed in the fragile coffins of folders. He was a keeper of dead words, and this service had dried him out to the consistency of parchment. In his world there was no thunder, only the quiet rustle of turning pages. But there was night. A night when the heavy doors of the archive closed, and Gromov's own heavy eyelids followed suit. And then another labor began. In his dreams, he didn't read stories. He wrote them. He was not a keeper, but an architect. With a mere effort of thought, he erected cities of black glass and populated them with obedient shadows. He was the law and the sun for his silent people. Here, in this boundless domain, his will was the sole measure of all things. But one morning the fabric of his dreams was torn by a rough seam of reality. File number 712 was missing, a faded ochre-colored folder containing the fate of some factory long turned to rust and dust. To the world, it was dust on dust, but for the head of the archive, a man of rigid precision named Petrenko, it was a breach of order. Order was his deity, and Gromov merely a negligent priest. Petrenko didn't shout. He spoke softly, evenly, and his words pierced the soul like icy needles. He spoke of duty, responsibility, and consequences. He spoke of how people like Gromov were merely screws in a vast mechanism, and a loose screw was subject to replacement. He was given 3 days to find the missing item or write an admission of his own insignificance. 3 days to prove his right to be an unnoticed part of the machine. In the evening, Alexey returned to his small room, which smelled just like the archive, of paper and hopelessness. He didn't search for the folder. He knew it was useless. It wasn't there. It had vanished, dissolved like ink under the scorching sun. He was guilty without guilt, condemned without trial. And that night, going to bed, he didn't want to build his glass cities for the first time. Grief and humiliation were poor building blocks for his architecture. He lay with closed eyes, and all his will, usually diffused in the creation of silent empires, compressed into a single point, into one desperate desire. He didn't ask. He commanded. He saw not a city, but the 7th shelf, the 3rd shelf from the top. He saw a thick volume of Gazette from 1912, and he saw the ochre-colored folder lying behind it, having fallen into the dark crevice between the book and the wall. He held this image in his mind with the strength of a smith holding red-hot metal. He wasn't sleeping. He was forging reality according to his blueprint. In the morning, he arrived at the archive an hour before opening. The air was still and cold. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from a premonition of sacrilege. He approached the 7th shelf. He ran his fingers along the spines of the books. There it was, the thick volume of Gazette. Gromov's heart beat against his ribs like a trapped bird. He moved the book aside. In the dusty darkness of the crevice, it lay, folder number 712. He looked at it, and the world split in two. There was a world where this was a simple coincidence, a trick of a tired memory that suggested something forgotten in a dream. And there was another world, terrifying and intoxicating, where his nocturnal will had become the hammer and the morning the anvil. He chose the first. It was simpler that way. It was safer that way. He took the folder to Petrenko, silently placing it on his desk. The chief surveyed him with a gaze that held neither gratitude nor relief, only a cold confirmation of Gromov's initial guilt. "Let this be the last time," the meticulous chief hissed and returned to his papers. The humiliation did not disappear. It merely took deeper root. And the next night, Gromov didn't build again. He lay in the darkness and thought of Petrenko, of his precise gestures, his impeccable handwriting, of his right hand which rendered judgments on paper with clockwork precision. Gromov didn't wish him death or illness. That would be crude. That would be someone else's story. He wanted his own. He wanted to make a tiny correction to this man's flawless blueprint. He focused on that hand. He imagined how within it, in the very core of its veins and nerves, a subtle tremor would awaken. Not a spasm, not a seizure, no. Just a barely perceptible tremor, like a string touched by an invisible finger. A tremor that would prevent the pen from moving smoothly, a tremor that would turn a perfect signature into a blot, and a confident gesture into a convulsive attempt to conceal a flaw. He honed this image, weaving it into the fabric of his sleep until it became as real as his cities of black glass. The next day, Petrenko called him to sign some order. He picked up the pen, and Gromov saw a barely noticeable, almost imperceptible tremor in his fingers. The chief frowned, gripped the pen tighter, but the tip still traced a jagged, ugly line on the paper. He disgustedly set aside the spoiled sheet, looking at his hand as if it were alien, a traitor. He didn't notice Gromov's gaze, and Gromov watched with no schadenfreude or joy in his soul. There was only coldness. The coldness of absolute knowledge. It wasn't a coincidence. Sleep ceased to be a refuge. It became a tool. And the world, which had once been a foreign book, now lay before him like an open page, awaiting his edits. Power without purpose is a poison seeking a vessel. The vessel was found soon. A sector head position was opening up in the archive, a modest role, but one that granted access to rare collections and the right to sit by the window. Gromov wasn't the only one eyeing this position. There was also Lebedev, a young man with clear eyes and quick, light hands. He had worked there recently, but his diligence and a certain bright, unwavering loyalty to his work pleased Petrenko. Lebedev was one of those who found joy in dust, who saw not decay in old papers, but the music of time. He was what Gromov might have become, had his soul not dried up before the ink on his first job application. Gromov watched him, watched how Lebedev laughed with other female colleagues, how easily he found the right document, how the sun, breaking through the murky glass, always seemed to seek out his light hair, and something dark and heavy, like wet peat, grew in Gromov's soul. It wasn't just envy, it was a feeling of deep, metaphysical injustice. He, Gromov, had been here in eternity. He was part of these walls, these shelves, and this young man was a guest, a random draft. And this draft could take his place. He could have done to Lebedev what he did to Petrenko, make his hand tremble, afflict him with migraines, undermine his health. But that would be too petty, too much like simple human revenge. Now he thought in different categories. He was not an avenger. He was a creator. He didn't want to spoil someone else's canvas. He wanted to paint his own picture on it. He didn't want to break Lebedev, but to rewrite him. The idea came to him suddenly, while he watched Lebedev, with almost filial care, help an old accountant sort through ledgers. He was a good person. And Gromov decided to steal this goodness from him. He decided to bestow a sin upon him. Not committed, but experienced. The memory of an act that never happened. That night, his dream was not like an architectural bureau. It became the office of a soul investigator. Gromov didn't see Lebedev. He saw his memory, his past, appearing before him as a long, impeccably clean scroll. He unrolled it, and scenes flashed before him. Childhood in a small town, the first fight, the first kiss, his grandmother's funeral, graduation from the institute. Everything was clean and bright, just like the young man himself. Gromov sought a place for his edit, and he found it. An emptiness. A year Lebedev rarely spoke about. The year after his father's death, when he was left alone and worked at the post office to support himself and his mother. There, in that faded segment of life, was a gray area, ideal soil for a black seed. Gromov took an invisible pen into his hands. He didn't just imagine. He felt its weight, the coldness of the metal, and he began to write. He wrote a story about how young Lebedev, driven to despair, opened a package in which an old woman was sending her grandson her life savings. He saw the young man's hands trembling, how he hid a wad of old, worn banknotes under his shirt. He detailed every aspect, the smell of sealing wax, the rustle of the money, the sticky shame that no tears could ever wash away. He pressed this image into the scroll of memory with the force of a printing press, until the false story became indistinguishable from the truth, sending poisonous roots into the living fabric of the soul. The next day, Lebedev didn't come to work. He appeared after lunch, pale with dull eyes, as if he had aged 10 years overnight. He walked past Gromov, not noticing him, and entered Petrenko's office. The door was not fully closed. Gromov didn't hear the words, but he heard the tone. Lebedev's suppressed, broken whisper, and the chief's rare, dry remarks, like the crack of a breaking branch. 15 minutes later, Lebedev emerged. He held a resignation letter, already signed by Petrenko. He went to his desk, silently gathered his few belongings into a cardboard box, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. Forever. No one ever learned what he had confessed. But rumors spread through the archive about some old theft, a sin of youth that had suddenly awakened in his conscience and burned him from within. A week later, Gromov was appointed sector head. He sat at Lebedev's desk by the window. The sun shone on him just as it had shone on his predecessor. But Gromov felt no warmth. He looked at his hands, the hands of a keeper who had learned not only to turn the pages of dead stories, but to write them on living souls. He got what he wanted, but there was no joy. There was only silence. A silence in his soul, like the silence in a house from which a deceased person has just been carried out. He didn't just defeat a rival. He committed a murder, leaving the victim's body to walk the earth. And in this absolute unpunished power, he felt for the first time not strength, but the endless, icy solitude of an executioner. His solitude turned out to be not an emptiness, but a vacuum that immediately began to absorb the world. In the first nights in his new post, he tried to return to his glass cities, to the silent architecture that had once been his comfort. But the blueprints crumbled to ash. His will, once unleashed, no longer wished to build imaginary worlds. It craved real clay, and the people around him became that clay. He no longer needed sleep to rule. Now, a simple, fleeting glance, a random thought, was enough. Old Anna Markovna, perpetually knitting in her corner, once dropped a knitting needle. Gromov fleetingly thought how clumsy her elderly fingers were. The next day, she came to work with a bandaged hand. She had stumbled on flat ground. The young courier who annoyed him with his loud chatter suddenly began to stutter, stumbling over every word, as if a lump of unshed tears was stuck in his throat. These were not commands given in sleep. These were weeds sprouting from the soil of his fleeting thoughts. The hammer no longer waited for the smith. It began to strike on its own. He tried to stop it, tried to think about abstract things, about the geometry of dust motes in a sunbeam, about cracks on the ceiling, about the featureless blue of the sky outside the window. But the archive was a living organism, steeped in human fates. Every folder, every sheet of paper screamed about itself. He picked up a probate file, and images of greedy relatives rose before his eyes. Their thoughts became his thoughts, and he felt with horror how his own contempt for them began to take on flesh, threatening to turn into someone's heart attack or sudden ruin. He touched the personal file of a missing soldier, and the cold of trench mud permeated his bones, and the despair of a mother who had waited for him for decades began to coil around him like poisonous ivy. He became a prisoner of others' stories. His gift, which should have made him free, turned him into the most miserable slave. He was condemned to hear all the prayers and curses sealed in these paper coffins, and his soul, against his will, responded to them, making its terrible edits. Petrenko, whose hand now trembled constantly, started visiting his sector more often. He stood silently behind Gromov, and Gromov felt his gaze, which no longer held supervisory strictness. There was only fear, the fear of an animal sensing something incomprehensible and unnatural nearby. But he could do nothing. Gromov was an ideal employee. He was never late, made no mistakes. He simply sat at his desk by the window, transformed into the silent center of a web whose threads spread throughout the building, throughout the city. He got his place in the sun, but the sun no longer warmed him. It merely illuminated his figure indifferently, as one illuminates a monument. He became that very mechanism, the screw, that Petrenko had once called him. But not a simple screw, rather a central gear whose invisible movement caused all other parts of the machine to twitch and break. He was the god of this small, dusty world. A blind, deaf, omnipotent god, whose sole function was to eternally rewrite the Book of Fates, without the power to tear out a single page or close it forever. And the disciple asked, "Teacher, what is the most terrible prison?" "The one where the prisoner is both the lock, the key, and the eternity behind the wall. The one in which the will, desiring to become a hammer, finds that there is no longer a hand to wield it, nor an anvil to strike. There is only an endless fall through emptiness, where every blow leaves a scar on oneself."